Welcome.
Great. Thanks so much, Kate. Really appreciate it. And it's so great to be here with you all today. As we're getting started, Kate, I don't know if you already asked this question, but if you guys could put a 1 in the chat if you have heard about behavioral insights before, and a 2 in the chat if you've never heard about this before and this is brand new to you, it would just be great to see where we're coming from. I can also give you a little bit of background to myself just really quickly. As Kate said, my name is Lindsay Moore, and I'm a principal advisor here at the Behavioral Insights team in Washington, D.C. So I head up our state and federal government practice. But my background is in state government and government in general. So I'm really excited specifically to be here with you all today. In my previous life, I was on the performance management team in the office of the governor in Colorado. So I know there are some folks from Colorado here. So really excited that you're here. And also I'm from California. I know that there are a lot of you from California here as well. And as Kate and Cassidy both know, I'm actually like a 6th generation government employee in my family. So really excited to chat with you all. As I like to tell people, state government is my favorite. Please don't tell all the other, city and federal folks, but I love it. I love what you guys do. So I'm just really excited to hear from you at the end of this as well, just to hear, what are you doing? How might behavioral insights help the work that you do at the state level? And just, again, learn more about you all as well. So as Kate said, I'm happy to go through this as quickly as possible to get to a point where we can have a conversation at the end. So we'll have time for Q&A, but if there at any point you guys have questions, feel free to, interrupt me and we can walk through something if something doesn't make sense, or if you want to learn more about it or anything like that. I'm more than happy to be interrupted. So I will move us forward. Kate, did that advance? Can you guys see the next slide?
It advanced, and I just add one thing. If you have a question, you don't feel comfortable unmuting to interrupt, feel free to add it to the chat, and I will ping Lindsay or give voice to it throughout the session. So feel free to use the chat for questions as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're good. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So what we'll plan to do in the next 60 minutes is just introduce BIT. We'll tell you a little bit more about who we are at the Behavioral Insights team, and more importantly, the concept of behavioral science. I'll then walk you through BIT's EAST framework, and within that EAST framework, we're going to see some examples of behavioral insights in practice. These are real examples that we've run with governments, and so we'll just show you a little bit about the kind of work that we do and how these different types of behavioral insights principles can be applied. And then, as we mentioned, we'll save about 30 minutes for discussion and Q&A at the end of the session. So just a little bit of background about who the Behavioral Insights team is. So we're a global social purpose company that was actually founded in 2010 inside the UK Prime Minister's office. And at the time, the book Nudge had come out, and David Cameron, who was Prime Minister at the time, was thinking, how can we take what's happening in the field of behavioral economics more generally and apply it to government, and specifically how to make government services more effective and more efficient. So since that time in government, we've actually spun out of government. So we became, again, a private company in 2014, and we now have offices around the world. And we at BIT, have run over 1,000 behavioral insights projects with governments at the state, federal, local levels, and then also, again, internationally in over 60 countries, including 800 randomized control trials. So we'll tell you a little bit more about what those are if that's a new concept for you. And then we've also trained more than 12,000 government employees, right, in what behavioral insights are and what low-cost evaluation is and how you guys can apply it to your work. And really the reason that we exist is that we want to design policies, programs, government services using more realistic models of human behavior. And we'll talk about what that means next. But basically our approach, right, is to take, again, this burgeoning field of behavioral science, which is really the study of how humans make choices and how they behave in real world contexts, and mixing that with rigorous evaluation. So really investigating those causal connections or relationships, right, between what it is that we're doing and what kinds of outcomes we're going to see in policies and programs, so that we can devise the best, government services that we can across the board. So to start out, let's just talk about this for a second, which is like, what do we mean by behavioral insights? And basically what we mean is this, that, classical economics and classical policymaking is designed for this person. I'm going to ask you who this person is. And because we're not in a room together, I'm not going to be able to see your answers. But I hope you all know who this person is. Can you put it in the chat if you know who this person is? I think we're going to see. Yes. I think we're seeing some Spock. Yes. Okay, good. This is Spock. Younger audiences don't usually know the answer to that question, which makes me really sad. But that's Spock, right? And Spock in Star Trek is somebody who makes decisions based on pure rationality, right? Cool, calm collectedness, like no emotion in that decision making, can process lots of information all at the same time. When in reality, we need to be designing government services more for this guy here on the right? Somebody who's really distracted, only giving us a couple seconds of their time, time, hasn't been sitting down and engaging with the types of, again, policies, programs, asks that the government has of them, super busy, super distracted. So no more designing for Spock, and instead we're designing for the busy common person. So when we talk about behavioral insights, again, behavioral science really is the study of how humans are making decisions in the real world. Again, considering all of those different distractions, demands on people's time, all of that in the context of how people make those decisions. And then updating that model from the sort of classical economic model of the human as a rational decision maker to somebody who, is busy and makes mistakes. And we, as behavioral scientists, really try to think about how people are what Dan Ariely, who's a researcher in this field, calls predictably irrational. How can we predict the ways that people are likely to err, right, in, engaging in government forms or participating in services or anything like that? And to do this, we ask ourselves questions like, how do our brains really work, right? What kinds of shortcuts do we take when we start making decisions? And if you'll indulge me for a second, a key concept that underlies all of this is called the dual process theory of cognition. And I think it's pretty cool. So we'll talk about it for a quick second. But the idea is this. So some of you on this call may have read Danny Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And in that book, Danny Kahneman, who is a Nobel Prize winner, he's actually the only person to win the Nobel Prize in economics who is a psychologist. So fun fact. But in that book, what Danny says is, look, we have two ways of thinking, system one and system two. Now, as a former neuroscientist, I have to say those are not real areas of the brain, but these are just like ways that we think about it. So in system one, right, this is the way of thinking that's really fast, automatic, intuitive, and effortless. So if I were to ask all of you, what's 2 times 2? I think automatically you would think 4, right? You kind of know that intuitively. The example that we like to give is taking your daily commute, right? So if there have ever been days when you all have like walked out of your front doors, and let's just say you get in your cars, right? And you take your right and you take your left, and all of a sudden you show up to the office and you think to yourself, I don't even remember driving. I knew how to get here, right? Your mind is wandering, whatever. That's a sort of fast, automatic way of processing information that you just didn't even really need to think about anymore. In contrast, we have system 2, right? And this is a really slow, reflective, deliberate way of thinking. It's very analytical. So if I were to ask you what's 24 times 17, we'd probably have crickets, right? Like you guys would know, like right off the top of your head, unless you're Rain Man. But in that case, most people don't know automatically what 24 times 17 is. You'd have to think about it. You'd have to do math. If you have kids in school nowadays, you'd have to have them do their math, because I don't understand how they're doing multiplication these days, but you get the idea. And the opposite example of taking your daily commute, something you do all the time that's really automatic, is something like planning a trip overseas, right? Where you've got to think about, where do I stay? How do I get there? How am I going to get around? Do I need to learn a couple of phrases if I'm going to a place where I don't speak the language? Those kinds of like deliberate and effortful ways of thinking. And so here's a picture of Dr. Kahneman, and he says, it turns out that environmental effects on our behavior are a lot stronger than most people think. So the environments that we're in can really influence our behavior. And we, I think, as government and service members, like we need to think about like, what are the environments that people are making these decisions in? How do we in our programs and services influence those environments as well? So really, I think the idea here is that we want to try to push as much of the demand that we're making on people's system 2 way of thinking into system 1, right? So we're trying to make more of our programs and services easier to engage with, more automatic, more intuitive of what it is that we're asking of them. What is it that we need from the folks that we're trying to engage? What decisions are we asking them to do? All that kind of stuff. And the way that system 1 works is really by simplifying larger decisions into more simple rules and heuristics, right? So if we take something like intuitions, right? Intuitions are really just the aggregate of all of our past experience and the assumptions that we have. Emotions, right? Like, how are we making emotional choices? Are they in a hot state or a cold state, as we like to say? Things like mental shortcuts, right? Like when we get really overwhelmed with information, we do something that we like to call satisficing, which is, we just sort of cut off, like, this is a good enough decision, are we doing that kind of thing? Biases, we should all be familiar with, right? These are assumptions and stereotypes that we carry with us, that we start to apply to certain aspects of a situation. And then, of course, social influence, right? What is everybody around us doing? How does that influence the way that we might like to behave, which we'll talk about a little bit more later when we talk about social biases. And so to do the work of behavioral science, oftentimes we have to understand the barriers to a behavior. So it's all about behavior, right? It's really putting human behavior at the center of everything that we're doing. And we have to understand what the barriers are to that. To do that, we generally do lots of like watching of people. So we do observations, like where are people erring? Sometimes that can involve things like we were working with the UNDP Women's Council once in Georgia, the country, not the peaches, where we were on the phone with domestic violence hotlines, right? And we're actually observing how hard is it to get through this hotline? How hard is it to talk to somebody in a state of crisis, right? Like, what are the things that are getting in the way? What are those barriers to getting the services that I need that we can start to identify just by watching people engage with the materials or the processes that we're asking them to engage with. We can also do this with interviews, right? Just sitting down with folks. I always like to say that the people on the front lines have the best, most creative solutions, right? Because they're the ones dealing with things that we never even see or would even think about, right? So you guys know how people walk into your offices or engage with your programs in a way that folks just sitting at a desk remotely aren't really going to think about. And interviews can really help to suss out, what are some of these things that you're seeing routinely over and over again that people are struggling with to engage the way that you want them to. But then there's also stuff like data, right? Like, especially at the state level, we always try to encourage people to use the state administrative data that you have to start to identify barriers in, where are people dropping off in your process? Or, is there a disproportionate representation of, this type of behavior versus that one? Or are certain types of people misrepresented in the data in a way that's anomalous, right? In a way that we might not expect if we do a little bit of digging into the data that we have. And then the last piece is, of course, secondary research, right? What's happening in other states, right? Where are other people experiencing similar challenges? And how might we be able to diagnose those types of barriers, just learning from others and being able to apply that work to our own, our own work that we do in our states. And the last thing I want to say about this is that, and again, coming from a state government background, it's really common, I think, for policies, for programs, for letters, for forms, whatever it is, to be designed from behind a desk, right? So at least in my old life, I used to sit at my desk for 8 or 9 hours a day and do the work that I was really intimately familiar with. And so I knew what I was asking of people, but I almost never thought to go ask somebody else, like, would you know what I want you to do, or how to engage, or how to sign up for this training that I'm giving, or anything like that, right? So thinking about it from the perspective of, again, the busy average person is not going to have the 8 or 9 hours that you have to engage with your tax forms or to engage with your DMV forms or whatever it is. And so really thinking about, the ways that we can make that more engaging and easy, I think is really important. Something that we do at BIT, we like to call the flip test. So basically what that is, again, I might be working with a state government and we're redesigning some sort of form or UX experience on a website or anything like that. And I'll take it to my boyfriend and I'll say, hey, Kevin, can you look at this for a couple of seconds and just tell me, I'll give it to him for, face down. Let's say it's a form, face down. And I say, you have 30 seconds and we'll flip it over. And I said, do you know what it is I want you to do? And I'll flip it back over. And if he says no, I have to go back to the drawing board, right? And redo it again. If he's like, oh yeah, I see that call to action. And I guess I'm supposed to respond to this tax notice in the next, 30 days. I'm like, success. That's great. So doing the flip test with people, with unsuspecting victims and your friends and family could be really useful, or around your office, right? Just to make sure that people understand what it is that you've redesigned and what it is you're doing. I think another key to behavioral science in general is understanding what is behavioral and what is not, right? So again, I went to policy school. I think we were taught to think a lot about, institutional barriers to engagement. So these are things that are legal or policy-based. So that's stuff like eligibility requirements, right? So you have to be a certain age to join the military. You have to be a certain age to drink alcohol or drive a rental car, right? All of those types of things that are more institutional, legal, policy-based types of barriers to engagement, right? So that even if you wanted to get, a bunch of people who are too young to drive a rental car or something, that's just never going to work, right? So that's not the right thing to try to nudge or to try to influence with behavioral science. The second thing we think about is situational barriers. So these are a lot more like logistical, financial based, physical based. One example that we often give working in like state workforce agencies or with like RECIA programs, reemployment training programs, are things like, look, if the reemployment services program is not accessible to the target populations that you want to take up these programs, if there's not public transit available, or let's say people have children and there's no childcare available, that kind of stuff, we think about those as more situational barriers, right? People who really want to do certain things, but it's too complicated to get there, or it's too out of the way, or that kind of thing. Or maybe people don't have access to the internet, or that kind of thing, is we think of as situational barriers. But where behavioral insights really shines is in this bottom part here around cognitive and behavioral barriers. And so these are things like beliefs that people have, so when we've been doing work on vaccine hesitancy, one of the things that we think about is like, do you trust your doctor as a messenger to tell you that you should get vaccinated? Or if not, who do you trust, right, as that messenger? Maybe it's a church leader, maybe it's somebody else in your community, maybe it's a trusted neighbor or friend, something like that. And the other thing we think about is, again, from a cognitive perspective, are things like language on a form. Is it too complex and overwhelming? So we like to think about bringing government, all the forms that we built in the 1980s, like bringing them from the 1980s to the 2000s. And now our work is about bringing them from the 2000s to the 2020s. We've literally been in, workshops where we're redesigning forms that were last redesigned in 1989, right? And we need to sort of update that language to be less legalese, less complex, less overwhelming, and maybe, use some of the tactics from behavioral science to make them more engaging, again, make them more understandable about what is it that you need me to do right away? How can I best engage with what it is that you're asking me to do? Okay, so the next question that we have is, well, okay, so we understand behavioral science, we understand how to understand barriers to engagement, but who is it that we're actually trying to nudge, right? Who is it that we're targeting? So I've made this incredibly up to scale, data-driven graph for you. Just to note, this is definitely not to scale or data-driven, but here we go. So on the x-axis here along the bottom, let's just imagine the left-hand side of this x-axis is that it represents all the people who always do what it is that you want them to do. And on the right-hand side, we have people who are determined not to comply, right? So think about this like a continuum, right? People who always do what you want and people who will never do what you want. And then on the y-axis here going up and down, it's the total number of people. And so somewhere along the line, we've got a lot of people who are hyper compliers over here. These are who we like to call our blameless Betties. These are people, these are the kids who always do their homework on time. They'll turn it in. You never have to follow up with them. They're going to do it right. They're very conscientious. They turn their taxes in on time, whatever it is, right? They're aware. Those are not the types of people that we try to use nudges for, right? Because they're already doing what we want them to do. On the far right-hand side of the spectrum, we have these malicious Margarets, right? These are people who, no matter what you tell them, they think that taxes are immoral and illegal, and they are never going to pay their taxes on time. They are determined not to comply with government asks. So these are also not people that we think can be benefited by a nudge, right? These are people who need more. We like to think of it on a scale of like nudge to shove. And these are the people that need a little bit more of the hard acts of like, nope, this is a requirement. This is the law. You must do this, rather than a nudge. That's something a little bit more light touch in the middle. But all of these people in the middle are the ones that we're really excited about, right? Like these are the people that we think can benefit from a nudge because they're just really busy, right? And they haven't given you the time that you need, and they're sort of getting forgetful, right? Or they're distracted, or they just, they meant to pay their taxes on time and April just comes around so soon every year and I've forgotten, right? Or people that kind of justify their behavior, like they could go either way. But, at the end of the day, they're just like, oh, I was just too tired to do that, or it just wasn't a priority for me, or whatever the case may be, right? This is where we can use the tools of behavioral science to help recreate the environment, again, to make sure that it's top of mind for people so that busy folks can really engage, right? So that even if you are distracted, you have to remember that like, oh yeah, I really should do my work search actions to stay, compliant with my unemployment insurance asks, right? Or, so that folks can't justify that they didn't know that was, the rule that I needed to follow, or I didn't remember I had to go to the DMV by that date, or whatever the case may be. So I'll pause there really quickly. Any questions before I tell you a little bit about evaluation? Kate, was there anything in the chat that I missed?
There was nothing in the chat other than someone saying they have a policy degree and still do not understand how to do their taxes.
Okay, amazing. Yeah, let's chat. Yeah, that's great. Okay, fantastic. So this is the point, I used to teach a research methods and policy evaluation course in grad school, and this is the point where everybody has to go to the bathroom, but please stick with me because I think this will be very, hopefully painless and quick. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about how we know what works. And a lot of the stuff that you're about to see in the EAST framework and a lot of the work that we do at the Behavioral Insights team is all about low cost evaluation. And specifically, we use randomized controlled trials. And in that case, what that basically means is, look, we start with a population of people. So that could be, all delinquent taxpayers in the state of Colorado, or, that could be everybody who needs to renew their driver's licenses in the state of Maine, or whatever it might be, right? And we split them into two groups randomly. And this is really key because basically what that means is that we have two statistically similar groups of people, right? So these should be roughly equivalent on things like demographic information and gender and age and race and all of those things that are more what we think of as observable characteristics, as well as these unobservable characteristics like how many people had on average eggs for breakfast versus pancakes for breakfast versus whatever, right? So statistically, they should be they should be identical, right? They should be similar. What that means is that then if one of those groups of people gets the intervention, so let's say they get the redesigned form, they get the redesigned service, they get the letter that uses some behavioral science magic in it, and then the other group gets what we think of as the status quo or the business as usual, right? When we compare the outcomes for those two groups, the only thing that should be different between them is whether or not they got the intervention, right? Which means that we can then derive causal inferences based on, did this intervention work? And if so, on whom? And if so, by how much, right? How big was this change that we saw? Or was there no change, right? And how can we determine that? And again, we just look at the outcomes, like this many people did pay their taxes on time, when in the control group, fewer people paid their taxes on time. We would know the intervention worked, that kind of thing. This is really important. I can't emphasize evaluation enough. Again, I don't come from a great math background. Again, I know I studied neuroscience and economics, but there are people that are really good at math. I always want to encourage folks, especially if you work in the public sector. I always like to say that I'm scared of public math, right? But I think it's really important to try to evaluate when and where we can, even if we're just starting from the beginning of just counting how many in this group and how many in that group, that kind of stuff. And the reason it's so important is that common sense is just not enough, right? So over the years, for anybody here that's studied, ethics or again, policy design, you've heard about some of the horror stories, right, of things that have gone wrong over the years. These are some prime examples that come to mind for me. Again, these are all incredibly well-meaning policies, but when they were put through the test of rigorous evaluations, especially in the forms of randomized control trials, we found that they actually backfired compared to what policymakers wanted to do to begin with. So one example is on early pregnancy prevention. So I don't know about you guys. Again, I grew up in California, so I went to a high school where I think they gave me a sack of flour or something like that to carry around in high school as a pregnancy prevention mechanism. I'm not totally sure about the theory of change behind that, but that's what we had to deal with. I don't know if you guys had to do something similar. But in more sophisticated programs, I think it's something like 2/3 of US school districts use some type of pregnancy prevention program like that. I think in more sophisticated school districts, they actually use what I like to call robot babies, right? They're actually baby simulators that will cry, and you have to change them and you have to feed them. Again, all with the idea of wanting to prevent teen pregnancy. When they ran a randomized control trial on this intervention in Australia, what they found was that those young women who were given baby simulators, these robot babies, were actually more likely within, I think, 5 years to become pregnant, right? So again, it's an example of a backfire effect. It's not what we would expect. It defies common sense. But that's what ended up happening. We can go into the details of why that might have happened later, but basically, I think some qualitative research on the back end showed that the girls that had received the robot babies felt like they got more attention from their parents and their friends. They felt like all of a sudden they were confident that they could take care of kids. It sort of demystified some of the things that, that they were thinking about having children, all of that kind of stuff. So again, a backfire effect. One of the other most famous examples is this Scared Straight program. So again, I'm not sure if you have heard of Scared Straight. I'm sure many of you have, but it's the program where young people in a community are invited to visit people in prisons, right, and learn from them. And the idea behind it is that, look, when you meet people who are from similar backgrounds to yours, right, who are in a prison population, and they tell you their stories, and they're basically supposed to scare you straight out of, not becoming like them, right? Not going to jail, not committing crimes, those kinds of things. And again, when they ran a randomized control trial, what they found is that the people that were in Scared Straight, that were enrolled in Scared Straight and went through that program were 34% likely to go on to commit a crime versus those in the control group who did not go through Scared Straight. Their control group population was 27% likely to go on to commit a crime. So again, when it put through a randomized control trial, the program ended up backfiring to what people were expecting. The last example that I'll give is about prison populations who were sex offenders, and when they had group therapy versus individual therapy, people who were in group settings were more likely to reoffend. So the recidivism rate was higher versus those in one-on-one settings. And again, you can imagine post hoc, you can imagine reasons why that might be, right? Like if you're in a group setting with lots of people who have committed a similar crime, it might lower your rate of thinking about how bad your crime was or something like that. You might also gain ideas for how to go out and perpetrate that crime again in the future. And so when they ran, again, that trial of one-on-one therapy versus group settings, and group settings had been the norm for that type of therapy, they found that obviously one-on-one therapy was much better and of course more cost intensive, but worth it as far as the recidivism return on investment. Okay, now we are getting to the part where we can talk about BIT's EAST framework. Again, I just want to check any questions, Kate, before we
jump in with one, and you may address this later, but
yeah.
Someone asked a question about, isn't it expensive to run RCTs, so randomized controlled trials? Can you touch on that, or do you want to hold that to the Q&A?
No, yeah, I'll touch on it now. That's one of my favorite questions. So I always joke that one of BIT's goals is to be here to demystify the fact that randomized controlled trials have to be like multi-year, multi-million-dollar affairs. So in traditionally they have been, right? Like they're quite expensive to run when you're dealing with a lot of different types of outcome measures and a lot of different program design, et cetera, but they don't have to be, right? And I think that we've seen a really amazing push in the last, I'd say, decade, although Kate, you might want to come into and talk about like your experiences here as well, in terms of running low cost evaluations. And so the way that we do it at BIT, there are multiple ways to do it, but the way that we do it at BIT is that we really try to, instead of doing these, again, like multi-year, multi-million-dollar RCTs, where you're looking at every facet of the airplane, right? Like we really try to narrow it down to like one letter, one form, one policy area, one system, right? And that what we try to do is what I like to say is like the ophthalmology approach of like A or B or C, right? B or D, and like keep iterating. So it's more about a culture of continuous improvement within government rather than again trying to get all of the different stakeholders together to do something huge. It's really about like the area that we can control and within our world and government, what can we do and how do we make our programs incrementally better over time? And that's sort of the way that we do it. And again, we can talk in Q&A more about strategies for making that happen. But Kate, did you want to add anything to that too, based on your experience?
No, I think that's great, and we'll talk about it more in a little bit. So go ahead.
Yeah, and we can give you resources too at the end about like Bloomberg Philanthropies has been doing a huge push on this over about the last decade with low cost evaluations with cities. And so like that might be some good resources for folks as well to see how it can be done really well in practice. And you're about to see lots of examples through the EAST framework. So okay, so when BIT first started, again, I talked about how we started in government, and when we first spun out of government, basically what we were trying to do is come up with a mnemonic or some sort of way of distilling a lot of the different psychology and economics research into ways that we could just easily understand how to apply behavioral insights and how do they fall under different buckets. The first iteration of that at BIT was a paper that we called Mindspace. We then, the next iteration of that is EAST, and that's the one that we currently use. So basically what this says is, look, if you want to change human behavior, you need to make things easy, attractive, social, and timely. And we'll go through what each of these means. So let's start with easy. Not to be tautological about it, but easy is basically the easiest one to understand, right? So what does it mean to make programs, services, forms, systems, whatever it is, what does it mean to make them easy? Here's some examples. Like one is about defaults, right? So a lot of you, have familiarity with defaults. Some big examples of this in the behavioral sciences literature are things like when you default to organ donation being the norm versus whether you have to check a box that says, yes, I want to be an organ donor. There was a paper several years ago now that talks about the outcomes of that in Europe, right, where we just made it a default that like we assume everybody wants to be an organ donor, but please check a box if you don't want to be, versus here in the US, we have to all check boxes at the DMV that says, yes, we're okay donating our organs. And the differences in donation rates are obviously astronomical. But defaults can be just as simple as for anybody that's ordered anything online, which I'm guessing is almost everybody, right? Like defaulting the check on the box that says, yes, of course I want to receive all of your marketing emails. Those are annoying defaults. It's what we like to call sludge. That's not good. It's the misuse of nudges. But again, you could think about what the assumptions are in your own programs about what are you defaulting people to do, right? Like, do you default them into, for example, payment programs for retirement, right? So this is, I think, a big, excellent use of the default, which is like when you join a new company or you join the government, do we default a 5%, contribution? Do we default a 3% contribution? Do we default a 7% contribution? Those kinds of things can actually help people save for retirement over the long run. Another one is about removing friction costs. And so friction is basically anything in your process, right, that makes it just a little bit harder. So oftentimes what we find, especially in places like state and federal government, is that when we map out a process of engaging, let's just say it's, again, doing your taxes or something like that, every bit of friction that you have in that yields a likelihood that somebody or some percentage of people are going to drop off at that point, the more that you ask them to do, right? So there's a way to bundle things, make it simpler, all that kind of stuff to make sure that we're not losing people as they're going through the system or the process. And then, of course, the last one, again, very easy to understand, is something like simplifying messages, right? Moving away from legal jargon and into things that, is plain language, people can understand, what it is that they're asking them to do. And, it's really clear how you want them to engage. So I talk about tax collection a lot. It's a personal favorite of mine, but how can we reduce the hassle of paying overdue taxes? This was a question that we were asked by HMRC, which is Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs in the UK. So it's the UK's equivalent of the IRS. And basically what they wanted to know was this. So the IRS would send, or in this case, HMRC would send a letter to everybody who had overdue taxes, right? They hadn't paid their tax on time. And this was the simplest of simple experiments, right? So basically we had what we call our treatment group, right? These are the people that are receiving something new, and that those are on the bottom. And then we had the business as usual. So what HMRC used to do is that they would send a letter to folks around the UK who had overdue taxes. And in that letter, there would be a link that would send them to the HMRC homepage that basically said, okay, here's your tax return. This is where you need to go. And then once the users were on that tax return homepage, they had to go through the page and find the form that they then had to fill out to turn in their taxes on time. So all we did, and again, simple, all we did was in that actual letter that we sent out, we changed the URL from going to the homepage to going directly to the form that they needed to fill out, right? So it's just a matter of changing one click on the website. And here's what we found. We found that response rates to letters that went directly to the form on the right here versus directly to the web page were 4 percentage points higher. And again, 4 percentage points might not sound like a whole lot, but when you're talking about thousands of people and millions of pounds or dollars that need to be collected in revenue, this can actually add up to a lot. Again, when you start to make these little tweaks and changes at the margins. So that's just one example of making things easy. I'm checking the time. Okay, I think we're on time. The next part is about making things attractive, right? So traditionally, there's a pop quiz coming up. You guys probably already got the shock. But when we traditionally make things, think about making things attractive, we think about things like design elements, and that definitely is part of it, but there's more. Okay, now you have your pop quiz, just like we're back in school. I hope you guys are ready. Please no cheating. So no Googling, no phoning a friend, no 50-50s here, like nothing like that. This is just purely for you. We encourage honesty if at all possible. So here's your pop quiz. Was Mahatma Gandhi older or younger than 50 years old when he died? Can you please type into the chat, older or younger? Just one of those two words. If you think he was older than 50 years old when he died versus if you think he was younger than 50 years old when he died. Good, I see lots of coming in. Okay, great. How old was Mahatma Gandhi when he died? Just Numbers. And don't look at other people's answers, just you do you. Okay, great. I see lots of answers still coming in. Fantastic. Again, no Googling. Okay, one more question on this pop quiz. Was Albert Einstein older or younger than 100 years old when he died? So again, just type in older if you think he was older than 100, or younger if you think he was younger than 100 years old when he died. And same question, how old was Albert Einstein when he died? Okay, great. I'm gonna now check the chat here. Okay, so we've got lots of guesses. These are all very good, excellent. Okay, fantastic. Okay, everybody thinks Albert Einstein was younger. Very interesting. Okay, cool. So here we go. Here are the answers. So Mahatma Gandhi was 78 when he died. And how many of you guessed that Mahatma Gandhi was under 78? We can look in the chat. So just think about that. If you guessed he was under 78, Albert Einstein was 76 when he died. And think about how many of you guessed that Albert Einstein was over 76 when he died. So what do we think happened here? I'll pause in case anybody wants to share their experience. Yes, Frederica, yes. And Anna, amazing. Okay, you guys are the valedictorians, amazing. Anchoring is definitely, yes, Corey, exactly. So what happened here was that, yes, anchoring influenced our effects and our assessments. So basically, if you remember, right, Mahatma Gandhi, we asked if he was older than or younger than 50. With Albert Einstein, we asked if he was older or younger than 100. Generally speaking, when you start to anchor people around certain numbers, they will coalesce right around those numbers. They'll start to guess that Mahatma Gandhi was around 50 plus or minus, right? Same thing with Albert Einstein, like, okay, he's probably much older, so plus or minus around 100. So yeah, anchors can affect our assessments. And this also works in situations where, like, even if you ask people for the last 4 digits of their social security number, right? And if the last 4 digits of your social security number are 9999, right? People will start to anchor things higher, including in things like price negotiations, versus if the last 4 digits of your social security number are 1111, right? You'll start to anchor things lower. And so these can have like really subconscious and interesting effects on the ways that we make decisions going forward. I think I had another example in here, but yeah, we'll have another example right after this, but really quickly about like making things attractive. So again, we talked about how there are elements of design and human-centered design, CX or customer experience, research goes into this as well. So it can be about things like grabbing attention visually, things like, colors mean something to us, right? So green means go, red means stop, right? And how can we use those types of things to our advantage? Personalizing. So people are always really attracted to things that are about them. And I think anybody that has social media, you'll recognize that, advertising, for example, is getting way too sophisticated. Like that's really about me and my niche interests, right? And, like all of that kind of stuff. Similarly, when you use people's names, so when you do a mail merge, for example, on a form or a document, and it really attracts our attention, right? And especially if it's like about me, my name, maybe my child's school or the town I live in, right? The more personal it can be to me, the more I'm likely to engage with it. Things like rewards and incentives, again, for those of you who have traditionally gone to policy school or other things like that, right? We think about rewards and incentives in the forms of like tax, right? Or other things like that. But it can actually go a lot beyond that. I don't think I have an example today of things like lottery systems, but lotteries are really interesting even in the ways that we construct them, right? So it might make sense to you all if you're like, hey, I've got $1,000 worth of Amazon gift cards that I can give out as a lottery for my team, right? And I've got, a couple thousand people that might participate in this, or a couple hundred people that might participate in this. And I want to give as many people the chance to win as possible. So I'm going to divide those 1,000 into, 100 each, and so that the maximum number of people can win. But what we sometimes find is that having a single big lottery actually encourages engagement more than having a bunch of little lotteries, even if your expected value for winning goes way up, like with the more chances you have to win. So even designing things like in that way, I think can be kind of an interesting way to think about it. And then, of course, catering to ego and the emotions. So again, I don't have an example of this on the slide deck today, but one of my favorite examples is the way that we cater to people's like identities and the ways that they think about themselves, their own personal motivation. So we see a lot of like, are you the type of person who, or, be an Arizona voter, right? Or, things like that, that really tap into like, who do I think that I am? And if I'm somebody that, believes that voting is important and I go to vote at the polls and I get a reminder that says like, be a voter, what am I more likely to show up, right? Really thinking about like, how does that align with the way that we both are and the way that we want to be in sort of our best self scenario. One thing that is also really interesting when it comes to attractiveness, of making things attractive is about how we frame things. So framing, I think, has gotten a lot of attention recently. This is a classic example that we use in the field of behavioral science that has gotten a lot of traction more recently because of something like the pandemic, right? So this was an old example that used to be used in the field where it's like, look, let's just say city A has a population of 600 people. It's likely to be attacked by a deadly disease, and you must select a strategy that's going to help city A. So you're like the chief of staff for the city, and you need to decide which of the following strategies is going to help. And here they are, right? So if you want to go with program 1, you're the chief of staff, and the program 1, all you know for the outcomes is that this program ensures that 200 people are going to be saved. Right? Program 2 is there's a 1/3 probability that all 600 people in your town are going to be saved and a 2/3 possibility that none of them are going to be saved. Program 3 is, look, even after you do program 3, 400 people are guaranteed to die. And with program 4, there's a 1/3 probability that nobody's going to die and 2/3 possibility that all 600 are going to die, right? You give these 4 program choices to the chief of staff. You guys can think about which one like sounds better to you, about which program option would you go towards. But for those of you reading this carefully, right, you're going to notice that basically, statistically speaking, all 4 of these programs yield the same option, right? What's the difference here? The difference is that programs 1 and program 2 are positively framed, right? And program 3 and 4 are negatively framed, right? So program 1 is all about like, oh my gosh, hooray, 200 people will be saved. Program 2 is a probabilistic function that basically means the same thing, that 200 people are likely to be saved. Again, program 3, you're guaranteed a negative outcome of 400 people will die. And program 4, again, the same probabilistic function. And so again, we can actually graph this out and see how people's decisions will change based on which of these programs they choose. And it's all well and good when it's done in like a game setting in a classroom. But I think that what's really important and interesting is that imagine that you're a doctor, right? Or imagine that your doctor comes to you and your doctor says, hey, Cassidy, you've got to have this surgery and there is a 10% chance that you're going to die, right? Versus, hey, Cassidy, you've got to have this surgery and there's a 90% chance that it's going to be just fine, like that it will be successful, right? Even that kind of framing can drastically change the ways that people make decisions, right? Again, that's the same example of a negative and a positive frame. So when we think about that in government programs, not necessarily that things should always be positively framed, but we really need to be cautious and careful when we think about the way that we're presenting information to the public. Again, probably not something that this audience needs to hear. You guys probably think about this a lot, but it's something that we study, from behind the scenes and try to figure out like what's the best way to frame this. And it doesn't have to just be about numbers. It can also be about things like, do you want to go to the doctor to be there for your children when they grow up versus do you want to go to the doctor for your own personal health, right? We're sort of agnostic as to which one of those is a more motivating factor for you to go to your checkup appointments. But by studying that with large groups of people, we can actually start to see which one on the whole is motivating for people and also dig down one layer and say, well, which one is more motivating to this group of people versus that group of people and those kinds of things. So a less macabre example, how can we settle outstanding parking fines? This was a question that we worked with the city of Louisville, Kentucky to try to answer. And I chose this example. We actually have 2 examples in attractive, which I think we have time for. But really quickly, I just wanted to show you all this example because on the left here was what we call the control version, the business as usual. This was the letter that the city of Louisville, Kentucky was sending out to try to regain money from overdue fines. On the right hand is a new redesigned letter that we sent out. And I just wanted to show you some of these principles in practice, right? So at the top here where you see the number 1, we put a pay now stamp, right? So when I talked about the flip test I do with my partner, this is the kind of thing that we're talking about where it's just like, do you know what this letter is asking you to do right away when you open it? And hopefully the answer is yes, I'm supposed to pay something. We also put in a social norm, which we'll get to in a minute. Down here, number 2, it says the majority of drivers who receive a parking fine in Louisville pay it within 13 days. So we're sort of setting the norm that, look, everybody else in the town is doing this. Like you should pay your parking fine within this time period. And then I think most importantly, this third piece here, which is about how to make it really easy and really attractive to help people pay their parking fines, right? So we show them how much they owe. We have the little sticker that shows you can pay by, Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, et cetera. We give them directly the link, where they need to go to pay their fine. And then we also provide them with their ticket and license plate number. Now, interestingly, again, for all of you who work in government, we also didn't restrict the fact that they can still pay over the phone or they can still mail in a check. But obviously those are more cumbersome for the city to deal with. So we'd rather have them go pay online, which is what we've highlighted and sort of made attractive. We put it in this little box, those kinds of things, right? So again, this is I think a pretty good example of just making things attractive. And again, this was really successful in terms of when we sent out the letter, people that received the new letter were twice as likely to make a payment. And if we had used that letter across all of the parking fines in the city, it would bring forward about $100,000 for the city of Louisville each year, which is pretty significant. The second example on attractive that I'll try to race through pretty quickly here was a question that we got asked by the city of Chattanooga, and we've actually done a full police recruiting report. So if you're interested, I'm happy to send that around. But the question was, how can we get more people, and specifically more diverse people, this is people of color and women, to serve on police forces? And so again, we worked with the city of Chattanooga and we developed 4 different postcards to try to recruit people into the city police department. And we worked with, Mr. Worley here, who is an actual police officer in the city of Chattanooga. And we developed these messages, right? And the first one was a service message. So it says, are you ready to serve? On the back of the postcard, it says, if you're the kind of person who's ready to serve, you're just the kind of person we're looking for. The next message was an impact message, and that's what would it mean to you, right, to be a police officer? And on the back, it said, just think what it would mean to you and your community if you became a police officer. The third one was all about the challenge. So are you up for the challenge? If you're the kind of person who thrives in challenging environments, you're just the kind of person we're looking for. And then the last one was about career benefits. So are you looking for a long-term career? If so, you're just the kind of person we're looking for. And on the back, again, you'll see other elements of making things attractive, like personalization, making it easy. We had a short URL that people could go to just submit their application to the police department. And then we also gave them what we called a false deadline, right? There was no reason for them to submit their deadline necessarily before March 28th of 2016. But sometimes when you anchor people to a deadline, it helps to prevent procrastination, where it's like, hey, can I get this by Friday? Rather than having it just float around in the ether, it kind of gives a cutoff date. And then of course we added a messenger. We'll talk about that more with, social effects, but Worley Johnson, again, a police officer, here's our messenger, and that's a messenger effect. So really quickly in the chat, which of these do you think worked the best? Number 1, the service message. Number 2, the message that emphasized the impact that you could have as a police officer. Number 3, the challenge of do you want to become a police officer? It's very challenging. Or the 4th, that it's a good long-term career. So I'm going to give you a couple seconds to respond. All right, I see some service. I see some career benefits. Cool, Gabby, I see you, 2 or 4, okay. Great, okay, so a lot of diversity here in terms of what you guys think will work, that's cool. Great, well, again, as somebody that comes from a public service family, my mother's partner and my brother are both police officers in our hometown. So this was a really interesting study to work on. And it turns out that challenge and career were statistically significantly better at getting more people into applying to the police force than the traditional service and impact messages. And importantly, it was almost 3 times better for diverse candidates, again, people of color or women. And when we asked about that, so this was actually very different than what I thought was going to happen. Like, I always think that service messages and impact messages are going to be the most effective. And when we sort of dug into this a little bit more, what we found is that the service messages and the impact messages are really traditional messages for public servants, right? These are messages that when you go to become a teacher, you go to join the government, you go to join the police force, you already know, right, that you're getting into a public service career. You already know that, like, you could create an impact for your community or for the people that you teach. But challenge and career messages are ones that are more novel, right? And that they might reach a different population of people, or they might be more compelling for people who may already know service and impact messages, but maybe they've never thought about it as a challenging career, or maybe they've never thought about the long-term career benefits of joining the government, right? So when we think about diversity in government hiring, these are some of the questions that we start to ask, just how can we frame things a little bit differently to attract different types of people or a different swath of people than we might normally attract in some of our hiring platforms. Okay, so I think we've got about 10 minutes left, and I'll quickly race through social and timely. I'll skip the social conformity experiment, but we could talk about it later if you want. But basically, the idea of making things social is that we are still all our middle school selves. So we really value what everybody else thinks about us, and we want people to think about us like in a good way, right? Like, we want to sort of abide by what everybody else is doing and the social norms. And part of that is also about messenger effects. So who says the thing, like who is doing the ask, can change whether or not people abide by it or how they interpret the information, right? So you could think about like whether the governor is making an ask of somebody versus, say, the person on the front line who's doing the work. Those two things might be a little bit different, right? They might resonate differently, not necessarily one better or worse, but they're just going to be a different messenger. I always like to say with my nieces and godchildren, right, that, if I say, oh, it's time to do your homework, like, let's go study math. And they're, my niece will be like, okay, yeah, that's great. And my sister-in-law will text me and be like, I literally just asked her to do that. Like, like what? So like Auntie Lindsay has a different effect than mom, right? And then the last one is about reciprocity and commitments, right? So this is the idea that if I do something even small for you, that people are more likely to want to do something back, right? So we've done this study, for example, on like job centers and texting job applicants, hey, we've reserved you a place at this new job center fair. And even that idea of like, hey, I've done something for you, I've reserved a place for you, gets more people to come show up, even if it's just a job fair. Like anybody could come at any time, right? That kind of thing. And similarly with commitments, right? So when we make commitments either to ourselves or publicly, people are much more likely to follow through on those commitments than if they don't make commitments. So one example of this is one of my favorite examples. We worked with the UK's health department, the NHS, right, to try to figure out how to reduce the overprescribing of antibiotics. And we can think about why that's really critical, right? Like they're super bugs, right? People come in with viral infections and they ask for antibiotics even when they don't need them. And it's causing lots of problems in the health community, public health community, right? So again, we worked with Dame Sally Davies, who was the chief medical officer of the NHS. And basically what we did is we just used existing data on the NHS to look at prescribing rates of antibiotics. And we took the top 20% of prescribers in, I think, Birmingham County, and we sent those doctors and the surgeries, what they call the surgeries, right, a letter that says the great majority, 80% of practices in Birmingham prescribe fewer antibiotics per head than yours. That's it, right? That was factually correct because we just took the top 20% of prescribers, excuse me. And we just said, hey, look, like you're out of the majority. And we watched what happened, right? So basically what we saw is we tracked antibiotic prescribing rates. This is the control group. So these are all people who did not receive that letter that said that they were, sort of out of the norm. Obviously this peak here, you can imagine that's when people actually need antibiotics. It's December, it's January, people are getting bacterial infections that require them. And what's really interesting to note is this black line underneath, right? So these are all the prescribers who received the letter that said that they were out of sync with the norm. And that gap that exists between that blue line and the black line underneath it was the effect, right? As of April, we sent everybody, so the control group and what we call the treatment group, the letters, and sure enough, you see those converge, right? So all of a sudden it starts working on the control group as well. When we tell people, hey, you're overprescribing compared to your peers, everybody prescribes fewer when it's, again, not necessary. You can still see that people are obviously prescribing antibiotics when needed. And what was really cool about this trial is that I think the UK at the time had set aside something like 23 million pounds to try to change the antibiotic prescribing rate by 1 percentage point. We ended up spending something like 5,000 pounds, and we would have spent less, except that there was a printing error. And we ended up getting 85% of the way there to their goal, right, of reductions. And that to me is like such a good example of a small nudge that can have big savings, both in terms of antibiotic prescriptions and cost savings on the back end. Okay, in the last few minutes here, we are going to go race through timely. The idea of making things timely is that, you know, when we tell people the information they need to know, can make a big difference, right? So this includes things like prompting people to do something, right? To do an action. Like, are you sure this is what you meant to do? You know, prompting them to like do their work search actions if this is about unemployment insurance, right? Like sending reminder SMS messages like, hey, you know, your license is about to expire. Be sure to head to the DMV, that kind of thing. Planning prompts is another thing that we get people to do. So it turns out that when you ask people to plan all the way through their actions, they're more likely to then follow through. Even just the process of imagining, how am I going to get to the voting booth on Tuesday, right? Like, when am I going to go? What time of day? How am I going to get there, right? Getting people to do that imaginative pre-thinking, you know, helps, again, to encourage follow through on their actions. And then the last one here is about discounting, and specifically what we like to call hyperbolic discounting. And this is the idea that we value things in the present more than we do in the future. So if I said, hey, Kate, I'm going to give you $125 next month or $100 today, which one would you prefer? Even though, with, you know, inflation jokes aside, $125 is better next month. For all sorts of reasons, we choose the action for today. This can also be things like putting off going to work out, right? Like, I would much rather watch my Netflix series tonight than go to the gym and exercise. So how can we, you know, bring things forward in time that we need to do, and not always push things off to the future? One example of this is like when you ask people in the moment, do you want chocolate cake or fruit salad for dessert? The majority of people say they want chocolate cake. If you ask, you know, next week on Thursday, are you going to want chocolate cake or fruit salad for dessert? More people choose fruit salad when planning for themselves in the future. So my last example here is how can we help people follow through on a license renewal deadline? This we did with the city of Denver, and basically, we did these two different types of planning prompts. We did a planning prompt where, again, they didn't actually have to fill this out. This was just a postcard we sent to people living in Denver at the time. I was living in Denver at the time, so I received this postcard, which was very exciting. But we just said, look, when are you going to have your insurance up to date? When are your emissions going to be up to date? And when are you going to go online to renew your deadline? Fill this out. Again, most people probably didn't even fill this out. They just looked at it, and we were prompting the idea of planning. And then the other one was a checklist, right? So what do you have to do? You got to read this card, make sure your insurance is up to date, make sure your emissions up to date. And then here's the planning prompt at the bottom. Here's when I plan to renew. Again, not required to in any way, shape, or form. And what we found is, again, a statistically significant result that both the planning prompt and the checklist prompt increased online renewals by almost 8%, which, again, if that was to everybody, would result in about 9,000 additional online renewals. You can start thinking about the time savings at the DMV, all of that kind of stuff that results in. So in conclusion, behavioral insights, again, can help us identify the ways that people are predictably irrational and how they interact with policies and programs. Where do they err, and how can we work with people's biases rather than against them? So how can we design for system one thinking? Evaluation is really, really, really important, and it can help us narrow in on what works, when, and for whom. And it does not have to cost a lot of money. So again, I really, really want to emphasize that. And that driving rigorous empirical impact is easier than we might think. And hopefully this is at least a starting point for you all to think about how you might want to drive that in your own programs and services. So please go forth and nudge wisely. Here's my contact details if you want to get in touch with me. Obviously, we'll have 30 minutes here at the end for Q&A, so happy to chat again about any of this as needed. And I think, Kate, you can also share you know, my information if anybody has additional questions after this. So thank you all so much.